All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, guys, do you remember this?
I know that not all of you are committed to my husband, and I respect that. Your candidate might be better on, I don't know, health care than Joe is. But you've got to look at who's going to win this election. And maybe you have to swallow a little bit and say, okay, I sort of personally like so-and-so better. But your bottom line has to be that we have to beat Trump.
Swallow a little bit and vote for Joe. And last night, that was the message that really won the day. That is what is so remarkable about this, is if you look at the polling, you look at the fact that, yes, Bernie Sanders had high favorability. Yes, people supported him on the issues. They decided, because the establishment lined up behind him, that he had this imprimatur, that he had this massive media bump, that they needed to swallow a little bit and show up at the polls and vote for Joe. But despite all of the coalescing, all of the establishment throwing everything they could at Bernie Sanders in the final moments before Super Tuesday, at the last moment they possibly could to try to take this away from him, even after having what was, by all accounts, a very poor showing last night, the delegate count, when it's all said and done, will be more or less tied. We're still waiting for all the results to come in from California. Every expectation that as we get those results in, the margin will widen. That will lead to additional delegate pickups for Bernie Sanders. So it will be very competitive in terms of the ultimate delegate count, even after a night that was as brutal as last night, yes, truly was. And what all that means is that Bernie is well in position to stage a comeback. But he's got to turn things around, and quickly. We're talking about days and weeks where he needs to shift the campaign in as dramatic of a way as Joe Biden was able to shift the narrative and the campaign in the dynamics in the final days before Super Tuesday. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, number one is to understand what actually happened. Don't listen to the media narratives that say that there's this massive, organic, anti-Bernie Sanders movement. No, that's not it. For example, let's take a look at what the exit polls had to say about Medicare for All. Voters overwhelmingly find Medicare for All to be an appealing position. It's popular in every state that we have seen so far. When voters are asked what candidates they trust most on the issues, they still routinely say Bernie Sanders on health care and on climate change. So the problem isn't the economic positioning. The problem isn't the core messaging around those issues. And the problem isn't that people hate Bernie Sanders. There's not this organic nobody likes him movement out there in the country. The problem for him was all about electability. Many of these voters just want to beat Donald Trump. And so when the signal went out that Joe Biden was the guy to beat Donald Trump, they all lined up behind him. What the Sanders people have to understand is that if they are going to win those folks back, they are going to need to shift that narrative so that people can see Joe Biden's flaws, how easily Trump will defeat him, and how Bernie Sanders is the candidate that truly can defeat Donald Trump in the fall. And if he doesn't do that, he's not going to be able to succeed here. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, some of that work has started already. Unconscionably, leading up to South Carolina and leading up to Super Tuesday, the Sanders campaign really didn't make much of an argument against Joe Biden. There were no negative ads on the airwaves. There wasn't much messaging coming out of the campaign. They took their eye off the ball and were focused more on Michael Bloomberg until this rude awakening in the final days. So now, what case do they need to make against Joe Biden? It's a case on policy, but it's fundamentally about electability. You have to go back to talking about trade, how Joe Biden supported every bad trade deal that has decimated our heartland. Have to talk about Social Security, one of the top issues, especially for older voters, a demographic which Joe Biden performs incredibly well. Go back to talking about war and the commitment to these bad war votes, especially on Iraq. These are all things that the Sanders camp made against Joe Biden leading into Iowa that they did not make before. Some of that work has started already. We heard that critique coming from Bernie Sanders last night as he spoke about the results.
We're going to beat Trump because this will become a contrast in ideas. One of us in this race led the opposition to the war in Iraq. You're looking at him. Another candidate voted for the war in Iraq. One of us has spent his entire life fighting against cuts in Social Security, wanting to expand Social Security. Another candidate has been on the floor of the Senate calling for cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Veterans Programs. One of us led the opposition to disastrous trade agreements which cost us millions of good-paying jobs. And that's me. And another candidate voted for disastrous trade agreements. One of us stood up for consumers and said we will not support a disastrous bankruptcy bill. And another candidate represented the credit card companies and voted for that disastrous bill.
It's a good case. It's one they should have been making all along. It is coming to a debate stage and a television near you. It's a good start, but it's still not enough. Because the area where there is the most opportunity to potentially pick up votes and the greatest weakness right now is with suburban voters. So look, I know a lot of people aren't going to want to hear this, but you need a game-changing shift, a media narrative, and an ability to grab a hold of that media narrative and change the fundamental underlying calculus. And the best idea I can come up with is at this point to sit down with Elizabeth Warren and offer her the VP slot on the ticket. Why? Why bring on a candidate who just lost her home state, got third in her home state, who doesn't have a whole lot of delegates to offer, somewhere around 50 right now is what she's collected. She has been, number one, loved by the media, and number two, she's been very popular with suburban voters, with white, college-educated voters. So if you bring Liz Warren into the fold, if you have not just her endorsement, I don't think that's enough at this point, and frankly, I don't think she'd give it at this point. But if you actually offered her a slot on the ticket, perhaps you could start to win back those suburban voters, especially if Biden does what Biden always does and reminds us all once again why he was so fundamentally weak as a candidate to start with. Look, Sagar, I think this is far from over. Delegate count more or less even. But when you are the anti-establishment insurgent candidate, they're going to do everything they can to put you down. They're not going to give you any breaks. There's not going to be any bounces, none of that. You have to take destiny into your own hands. I know it seems like a bit of a long shot at this point, but you have to fundamentally change the calculus. And I think the person who could help you to make inroads with those communities and change the math, because that's what you have to do. The coalition you have right now is not enough. You have got to add something in. I think the easiest thing to add in is the suburban vote, a very powerful part of the Democratic constituency. If you can take the coalition that Bernie Sanders, working class, young people coalition, Latinos coalition, and add to that the suburban vote, then you start to be in range of pulling something off.
You do, but the problem is Warren does not have enough of a lock on that vote. That Biden and Klobuchar and Buttigieg and his wins and Obama and all of that has basically given them the permission that they needed. I agree. I actually think it comes down more to Sanders' message. And it goes to another thing that you pointed out, which is that people in the suburbs care about electability. And the way to make an electability case is a policy differential. And he has not made the policy differential in a substantive way since, a couple of debates ago, whenever he was with Joe Biden. He basically counted him out. I mean, look, everybody did. Everybody was like, oh, Joe
this is over,
is done and all that. But they took their eye off the ball. They didn't realize how much of a latent and sleeping threat that Joe was, that how the establishment could coalesce in that single moment. And you know what? This always comes down to a core critique I've always had of Sanders, which is that the establishment has no love for him, and he seems to have too much love for them.
Yeah.
And I mean that in that he's basically counted himself out by saying, yeah, I will vote for and I will campaign for as hard as I can whoever the next nominee is. Do you know what Trump did? He not only didn't say that, he's like, I will burn this shit down.
Well,
if that doesn't happen.
And that is the other case that needs to be made here.
Yeah.
Those young voters who are so excited to vote for Bernie Sanders, this is an electability case. Are they going to show up for a Joe Biden? The answer is no, not in those massive numbers, and that is a real problem. But on the math, look, what did we learn with Super Tuesday? We learned that the media narrative is everything.
Yes.
I mean,
earned
media narrative is everything. So you have to think about, what can we do to grab a hold of that media narrative? You still have in the media a lot of people who love Elizabeth Warren. I mean, she is the favorite candidate of the media. If you can get her on board, which is something, look,
it's going to be challenging.
It could be challenging. That's why I think that you have to offer her something as high level as a VP pick to even get her to potentially consider it at this point. But if you can do that, then you start to win the media narrative, and you saw how quickly those voters shifted. Look, I think that the suburban vote is still as fluid as it ever was. That's the vote.
Especially if Biden has a bad debate performance and he implodes again,
which
we all know he will. You can bank on that.
There's a good chance that will happen.
It will happen. Yeah.
So when he reminds people of why they were so nervous about him in the first place, and if you have this coalesced ticket of at least one person that the suburbs have loved, been excited about, that the media's loved and been excited about, then you start to have a shot again. Then you start to be able to win. Throughout this whole campaign, the suburban vote has been the most fluid. That is the thing that you have to go after. And look, maybe they are all locked in for Joe Biden at this point, in which case you're toast.
You do still have to try.
That's the thing that you have to bet on, is that is the vote that you can win into your camp, because they've been the ones that have floated around the most.
That's a great point.
All right, Sagar, looking forward to your radar. That's next.